Okay, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Hello, everybody. Hope you are doing great. You're watching FOADEBATE. Today, we are diving into a critical and timely issue, the recent threats made by Donald Trump against Venezuela and the hidden dimensions of this escalating crisis. All while the world watches with growing concern. I'm truly honored to be joined by Caleb Maupin, an esteemed journalist and political analyst from the United States. Caleb brings a deep expert perspective to help us unpack the real objectives behind these threats and the potential scenarios that lie ahead. Thank you so much, Caleb. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Absolutely. Glad to be here.
You're welcome. Let's jump right into the questions if possible. In your view, what is the primary reason for Trump's renewed focus on Venezuela at this specific moment? Trump recently targeted Venezuela vessels under the pretext of the so-called war on drugs. What do you believe is the real driving force behind this move?
I believe that Donald Trump, in order to get into the White House, had to make an alliance with a number of different figures. One of the factions he aligned himself with is a group centered around the Miami Cubans, people who fled from Cuba after the rise of Fidel Castro and set up shop in Florida, in southern Florida. Marco Rubio has been aligned with these forces, and these forces are heavily involved in organized crime. In the 1990s, they were involved in smuggling and all kinds of bombings and assassinations that took place in Cuba. And these forces have been enabled by the American government to be involved in organized crime because that is useful in destabilizing South and Central America. They've been called the Miami Mafia, and they're very closely tied in with the Israel lobby. They're very closely aligned with Likud and Netanyahu's faction in Israel. They are fanatically anti-communist, and they are very devoted to overturning the Cuban Revolution, as well as governments aligned with it throughout South and Central America. And that Trump, in order to take the White House, he was going against the majority of the rich and powerful in the United States. And he did kind of enter an alliance with this particular faction. You can call them the Miami Mafia, the Cuban exile community. There's a lot of wealth and power there. And they have a particularly obsessive drive in their foreign policy. They're not interested in the overall interest of the United States. They just have a particular vendetta against Cuba and its allies throughout South and Central America. And that they are pushing this. It's not about drugs. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency's own documents show that Venezuela is pretty inconsequential in the international drug trade. I mean, it's not that there aren't drugs in Venezuela. There are to some degree, but compared to Colombia, compared to Ecuador, the narco gangs in Venezuela are quite weak. And that Venezuela is really not an essential place for the drug trade and for drugs that are flowing to the United States. It really is kind of inconsequential in the overall scheme of things. So I believe that's just a pretext, and that Trump is trying to appease the particular faction of the Republican Party that he's aligned himself with, and allowing them to threaten and escalate against Venezuela.
Okay, and do you consider the possibility of a direct military conflict?
I think there are three possible outcomes in this situation. The first is a repeat of what happened during Trump's first term, which is that there are threats, there is escalation, and then the Trump administration ultimately moves on to other foreign policy ventures and nothing happens. The second is that there are strikes on Venezuela, which I think is a real possibility. The USA may, conduct airstrikes and attack key sites in Venezuela under the pretext of the war on drugs. The third possibility would be a direct ground invasion. I really hope that does not happen. I believe there is a chance it could happen. And if that happens, it would have very, very dangerous implications for the entire region and for the whole world. First of all, one of the biggest problems we have in the United States is there's a constant inflow of migrants along our southern border. They find dead bodies along the U.S. border with Mexico every day. There are criminal organizations that participate in smuggling people into the United States. And there are a lot of people in South and Central America and countries like Guatemala and Honduras who cannot live in their own country, are living in poverty. Often they don't speak Spanish, but rather indigenous languages. They don't have running water. They don't have electricity, and they're flowing into the United States. Now, if Venezuela were to go from being a very stable country, which it is at this point, a very stable country, to having its government completely overthrown, to being cast into the chaos, to having U.S. troops there fighting against the Venezuelan government, the result would be a huge increase in that instability flowing into the United States. Trump was elected saying that he wanted to address the migrant crisis. Well, the migrant crisis would get far worse if a major government in South America were overthrown. Trump was, saying he wants to fight the drug cartels. Well, if the Venezuelan government were violently overthrown and Venezuela was cast into instability, drug cartels would increase their presence in the country because people would be desperate and they would need protection, and the formal state would be gotten rid of. Everything that Trump said he was running for office to address would be made worse by a direct ground invasion of Venezuela. An attack on Venezuela would be, unjustified and would be a crime, and I would oppose it. It would absolutely not be necessary and would not be legal under international law. Venezuela is not an aggressive country that has not attacked the United States in any way. So strikes on Venezuela would be, completely unconscionable and wrong. And my hope is that what is most likely to happen is that Trump will de-escalate and move on from this. He will have satisfied Marco Rubio, his Secretary of State, threatened Venezuela sufficiently, and then he will, transition to another field of foreign policy focus, which is what happened in his first term. We remember in his first term, John Bolton, who Trump is now prosecuting, worked with Mike Pompeo and Elliot Abrams, and they provoked a situation, and they actually had a food truck that went into Venezuela, which they lit on fire themselves. And they were caught lighting their own food truck on fire, hoping to blame the lighting of the food truck on fire on Venezuela to justify U.S. military intervention in Venezuela. Luckily, a reporter from the Gray Zone, Max Blumenthal, showed that the Venezuelan, food truck, it was actually lit on fire by Venezuela's enemies at the Colombian border. And so after that, interest in attacking Venezuela among the Trump administration decreased. Trump reportedly told John Bolton, he said, "I'm bored of Venezuela," and they just kind of moved on. And I hope that there's a repeat of that here in Trump's second term and that he just moves on at some point. But these provocations, these sinking of ships, with people on them who, are just accused of being drug dealers with no evidence presented. We don't even know their names, and Trump kills them. That's completely unacceptable. It's illegal under international law. And Trump is hoping to provoke a response from Venezuela that can then justify further attack. And that looks to be the game. He's looking to poke and threaten Venezuela, to kill their citizens, their peaceful citizens on boats, etc. If these individuals on boats that Trump has attacked, if they were really drug dealers, the U.S. government wouldn't be sinking their ships. It would be seizing their ships as evidence to build its case that Venezuela is somehow involved in the drug trade. They're not doing that. They're simply sinking the ships and killing the people on board. And they won't even release the names of these individuals on board the ship who they killed because they don't want there to be an investigation to show whether these people were really drug dealers. They're attacking ships, sinking them, and saying, "Oh, they were drug dealers, believe us." Well, that's not legal under international law. People have the right to due process. The U.S. government doesn't have the right to kill people, accusing them of being drug dealers without at least having a court hearing, without at least telling the world what their name is. So these strikes are completely illegal, but the hope is, to provoke Venezuela and then justify further attacks.
Right. The timing of the Peace Prize being awarded to Corina Machado, an opposition leader in Venezuela, alongside the escalation of Trump's threats, seems highly coincidental. What strategic message or underlying scenario do you think this synchronicity reveals?
Well, I don't think it's an accident at all. I believe the Nobel Prize Committee has very much discredited itself. They've given the award previously to people that are working against the government of Iran, and now they gave it to someone who's working against the government of Venezuela, someone agitating for war and intervention in their country. How are they worthy of a peace prize? Right? A peace prize should be given to someone creating peace. Trying to justify regime change in Venezuela is not creating peace. That's pushing for war. And the Nobel Committee has very much discredited itself in many ways. This is almost as embarrassing as when they gave the prize to Barack Obama just because he took office. And then Obama proceeded to be a warmonger and overthrow the government of Libya, and destabilize Syria and do all kinds of escalations, carry out the coup in Ukraine. Obama was not a peace president, but just as he was taking office, they gave him the prize just for no reason. You almost wonder if it was a bribe or something to that effect, because it was pretty ridiculous. And that the Nobel Peace Prize was something that Trump wanted for himself. And he made a lot of noise saying that he wanted to receive the prize himself. It seems like the Nobel Prize Committee gave it to someone who is pushing for Trump to militarily intervene, almost as a way to say, well, we're not going to give it to you, Trump, but we're going to hint at what we want from you. If we give you a prize, we need you to attack Venezuela. It was almost lobbying Trump to attack Venezuela. And the Nobel Prize Committee stating that while Trump has made a huge amount of noise saying he wants the prize. We're not going to give it to him. We're going to give it to someone aligned with him who has a particular agenda. It was almost the Nobel Prize Committee endorsing an attack on Venezuela. What I thought was the most interesting thing was that Trump, he was friendly to the woman who received the prize, but then he said that he deserved it. And the Russian President Putin spoke up and agreed with Trump that he did deserve it for resolving various conflicts around the world. And there were friendly exchanges between the Russian president and the U.S. president, agreeing that Trump deserves a prize for resolving the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the conflict in Thailand, and other conflicts, conflicts on the African continent. So that was quite interesting to see that President Putin of Russia and President Trump exchanged friendly words in relation to the Nobel Prize after it was given to someone else.
Can we consider this threats as part of a broader U.S. grand strategy to counter the influence of Russia and China in Latin America?
Sure. One thing that I will say is key in understanding what's going on with Venezuela right now is that, the rise of the government of Venezuela, first Hugo Chavez and now his successor, Nicolas Maduro, it came on the continent as part of a much broader movement where you had Evo Morales in Bolivia, you had Rafael Correa in Ecuador, you have the Sandinistas returning to power in Nicaragua, and that there were a number of governments that emerged in the early parts of the 21st century, and they were socialist governments, anti-imperialist governments, and they were really a representation of the kind of previously silent majority of people in South and Central America. The majority of people in South and Central America are darker skinned, and until the 21st century, many of them did not vote. They lived in rural areas, in the jungles, in the countryside, and they were unable to participate in the elections. And it was the white landowning, the lighter skinned, formerly Spanish landowning people that tended to dominate the elections, even though they didn't have a majority. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, when these countries moved away from military dictatorships and started transitioning toward more open societies, that laid the basis for these folks to start getting involved in the political process, and they want economic development. They want jobs and schools and healthcare and education because they're impoverished. And the socialist movements of the 21st century, Bolivarian socialism after Simón Bolívar, who was the liberator, the anti-colonial hero of South America, these movements gave expression to this kind of silent majority getting involved in politics on its own accord and asserting itself, first with mass social movements like the fights against the privatization of water and the miners' strikes in Bolivia and the Caracazo in Venezuela, an uprising against cuts in public services. And this majority asserted itself, and they entered kind of an alliance with industrialists and national capitalists that were anti-U.S. and opposed to U.S. neoliberal economic policies that were looting the country. Under the Obama administration, the USA realized that if it continued to back its traditional allies in South and Central America, they would lose. Traditionally, the United States was aligned with the militarist right wing. People that are wealthy but are tied into the military in these various countries that tend to be very racist, tend to view the darker skinned people as inferior, tend to, support, murder and, all kinds of criminal activities. The U.S. government has backed a number of dictatorships throughout the region, and that's who the USA was aligned with. And those people were outvoted largely. They didn't have the votes. They didn't have the majority among the population, and they were discredited because their crimes and atrocities that went on during the Cold War in the 70s and 80s, the brutal dictatorships were being widely understood. Rios Montt, the former dictator of Guatemala, was put on trial, and many different military regimes throughout the region, Chile's, the Pinochet government, they were discredited, and the silent layer of the population that had opposed them was now actively popular. So because of that, the United States pivoted its policies. And under Obama, we had the United States supporting forces that weren't the traditional allies of the United States, not the military right wing, but rather kind of centrist forces like Social Democrats. And that significantly weakened the Bolivarian movement, because instead of just opposing the militarist right wing that was widely hated, the USA was, presenting its own version, watered down, false version of the socialism that the Bolivarian leaders advocated, and that transition very much weakened the Bolivarian movement, led to the overthrow of Evo Morales, led to the overthrow of Rafael Correa and the rise of Lenin Moreno, who completely, dismantled the socialist project in Ecuador. And those policies under Obama were actually much more effective in fighting against Bolivarianism and against socialism. Venezuela still remains a socialist country. Nicaragua remains a socialist country, but the other countries have largely been overturned, and the USA has been able to manipulate and maneuver and put kind of soft radicals in who emphasize identity politics. The LGBT issue is now focused on by a lot of these fake left forces that are supported by the United States. The emphasis on degrowth and the idea that because of climate change, we need to reduce the population, we need to reduce consumption. There's a whole fake left, you can call it, or a synthetic left, or a US-backed left that is really dominant in Latin America, and that is what has weakened Bolivarianism. However, that militarist right wing that the USA previously backed, they have felt abandoned by the USA, and they've been kind of left out to dry. And some of the voices of the militarist right wing have actually begun supporting Russia and saying that they want economic development of their country and that Russia and China might be good allies, and that there are some forces among the militarist right wing that used to be aligned with the United States that see the economic devastation happening, and they're alienated from the kind of moderate left that now has dominance, and they're positioning to align with Russia. So Trump is trying to remain and kind of shore up support and keep the militarist right wing that the USA abandoned in Latin America, kind of keep them in the US camp and keep them out of the Russian camp. And that Miami mafia that Marco Rubio is tied in with, they are very much aligned with the old allies of the United States, the militarist right wing. And so Trump is trying to keep the militarist right wing and appease them and keep them in the U.S. camp, when many of them are starting for nationalist reasons to pivot in a pro-Russia and China direction because they're alienated by the moderate left that the USA is backing. And so this is a very interesting development. But, in Venezuela, Maduro is supported not only by socialists and communists, but also by nationalists, Peronists, people that maybe would have supported some of the previous military dictatorships who want Venezuela to develop economically and don't like neoliberalism. And Maduro, to his credit, is socially conservative, right? There is no gay marriage in Venezuela. Abortion is illegal in Venezuela. And that Bolivarianism emphasizes the economics of socialism, but it doesn't embrace the identity politics and the kind of leftist cultural values that are associated with socialist movements in other parts of the region. And so what we're seeing is kind of a realignment. The USA has abandoned its traditional allies, the militarist right wing, but Trump is trying to hold on to them. Meanwhile, Bolivarianism and anti-colonialism as a movement have been weakened because of this maneuver by the United States. And this is all kind of a reshuffling of U.S. foreign policy south of the border.
Fantastic. Let's talk about the resources of Venezuela. I mean, energy resources. As you know, Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves. How significant a role do these energy resources play in stimulating U.S. interest?
Well, Venezuela is a major oil producing country. And the reason that Maduro's government even came into power, before Maduro it was Hugo Chavez, was because when the USA invaded Iraq in 2003, they destroyed a major oil producing country. They blew it to bits. And as a result, the oil prices shot up to the highest they had ever been in history, over $120 a barrel, some of the highest prices in history. And as a result, that made a lot of money for American oil companies, but it also enabled rivals of the United States who produce oil to see a rise in their profits as well. And it was that oil price jump created by the U.S. invasion of Iraq that enabled Russia to stabilize its economy. Putin used oil and gas, Gazprom and Rosneft, to stabilize the Russian economy. That's what enabled Libya to get very strong and to rise to leadership of the African Union. That's what enabled Iran to very much increase its strength in the region. We saw, with the rise of Ahmadinejad, and we saw how Hezbollah was able to defeat the Israeli invasion and become the heroes of the whole Muslim world when they defeated the Israeli invasion a couple of years after that in Lebanon. And that oil-producing countries that were rivals of the United States saw a huge rise in their revenue, and that created a new layer of opposition to U.S. dominance and power. Within the United States, it also created the fracking cowboys, which is the USA started extracting oil from its own shale, right? Rather than importing oil or drilling for oil, they use the hydraulic fracking process. And because of the high oil prices, hydraulic fracking was profitable enough that a layer of new oil companies emerged in the United States that could make money from this new process of hydraulic fracking. So the rise in oil prices shifted the global economy. And since then, Obama came into office. He destroyed Libya, a major oil producing country, reduced it to rubble and chaos. Then he worked with Saudi Arabia to drive down the oil prices. And he drove down the oil prices, and that was intended to weaken Iran, weaken Venezuela, weaken Russia, and also weaken the fracking companies that were the funders of the Tea Party, that was the Republicans that were opposing Obama. And Obama very much worked for the super major oil companies, ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron, these four corporations that function as a cartel that dominate the oil markets internationally. Those four corporations, that's, almost all of the world's oil markets. They don't want any competitors. Venezuela, it has taken control of its oil resources. And in 2003, with the oil prices very high and with Hugo Chavez very popular, they restructured their state-run oil company so the profits would go into the Venezuelan budget. They used that to then, build up a socialist economy in Venezuela and to strengthen a state, a socialist state in Venezuela. That's why they're a target. And I believe the ultimate goal is the same thing that Obama did to Libya, the same thing Bush did to Iraq. They want to take a competitor on the international oil markets and blow it to bits and unleash chaos and make it no longer a competitor so that people will buy from the American monopolies, ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron. That's what I would argue that it's about. At the same time, Trump is closer to some of the rivals of the four major oil companies, the people who were in the fracking companies, lower level capitalists, et cetera. And he's also close to that Miami mafia that's tied to the militarist right wing and the USA's traditional allies in South and Central America. So it's a complex situation. But ultimately, the goal is to destroy a major competitor on the oil markets. Let's keep in mind that Barack Obama was fully on board with the efforts to overthrow and destabilize Venezuela, and that his policies, especially during the oil price drop in 2014, 2015, 2016, I visited Venezuela in 2015. I mean, Obama was really hoping to just destroy Venezuela economically in order to lay the basis for a coup and the overthrow of the Venezuelan government. And his policies were crippling. But Venezuela got through it. And now Venezuela's economy is quite strong. And they're producing their own food, which they didn't used to previously do. And they have an alliance with the Islamic Republic of Iran that's very close. And Venezuela is much more economically stable than it was. In 2015, when I was in Venezuela, things were very bad. But now things have really improved. And so I think that in this situation, a coup against Maduro, some kind of domestic uprising inspired by the United States is highly unlikely. The USA would have to send military forces to actually overthrow the Venezuelan government. I don't even think the USA would probably be able to overthrow the Venezuelan government with airstrikes. It would ultimately have to be a ground invasion. I don't think Trump is prepared to do that. And if he is, it could mean World War III because Russia and China are prepared to defend Venezuela.
Fantastic. You are explaining comprehensively and covered most of my questions. Thank you so much. And for the last question, please, I would like to know about your perspective about Iran and how this stream can have impact on Iran.
Well, as I said, the Miami Mafia is closely aligned with the Likud party, the Netanyahu faction in Israel, and that Iran and Venezuela are viewed by the United States and its foreign policy apparatus in a similar way. These are governments that they consider to be dictatorships because they oppose the United States and challenge U.S. power in the region, because they don't accept the liberal democratic model that the USA would like to impose, and they don't have free market economies where Wall Street can just sink its fangs into the country and do what it wants. And so Iran and Venezuela are viewed in a similar light. And, there's an exile community. If you go to Southern California, we have a lot of the people that were aligned with the Shah that fled Iran in 1979, and they're obsessed and they want to overthrow the Iranian government. You also have the Mujahideen Khalq, the MEK, which is a terrorist group, and they have supporters throughout the United States. And they're very similar. They're just like the Miami Mafia of Cuba. They're a lobby that works very, very hard to overthrow the Iranian government. And they're not concerned with the overall interests of U.S. foreign policy. They just want to take revenge and destroy Iran. And it's very similar to the Miami Mafia, that they don't care about the overall interests of the United States. They're just concerned about their short-term vendetta against Cuba, against Venezuela, et cetera. You can notice that the the propaganda against Iran and the propaganda against Venezuela is somewhat similar, in that, there are all kinds of forces throughout the Middle East that are aligned with Iran. The people of Yemen and the Ansar Allah movement that I've written a book about, they are inspired by the Islamic Revolution. Hezbollah is inspired by the Islamic Revolution. There are Pakistanis, there are Iraqis that are inspired, and that Shia Islam and the Islamic revolutionary tradition of Khomeini and Khamenei, that has a lot of support throughout the region. And the way this is portrayed in American media is these people are all agents of Iran, and this is Iran trying to build an empire throughout the Middle East. That's the way they talk about socialism in Latin America. They say that Venezuela is a colony of Cuba, right? And that these movements throughout the region, these communist parties or these political groups that are anti-imperialist, they're just agents of Cuba, and this is Cuba trying to take over. Well, that's not the reality of the situation in the Middle East or in Latin America, but this is the propaganda that is used by the West. And both Iran and Venezuela have a lot of oil, and they use the oil to build up an independent economy. And the USA has manipulated the oil markets to try and weaken both countries. And now the USA and the Trump administration is using military threats and attacks. In the case of Iran, the USA struck Iran to support Israel recently. And they're using, they're building up and threatening Venezuela. They're using similar tactics to threaten both countries. So I see a similarity there. I will add that both Iran and Venezuela have revolutionary governments that come out of anti-colonial traditions, but neither Iran or Venezuela are Soviet-style communist governments, right? Iran, it's not capitalism, but Islam. It's the Shia Islamic revolutionary tradition. Venezuela is Bolivarian socialist. Nicolas Maduro is a Roman Catholic. They've very much adopted, kind of a mixture of socialist and Marxist politics with Roman Catholicism and Christian teaching, as well as the indigenous practices in the indigenous communities. And so neither country is Soviet-style Marxism. It's its own kind of domestic interpretation of an anti-colonial ideology, specifically built for the people and their traditions and their culture in the region. Venezuela culturally is very different from Iran, but they both have set up a model that is for their own people, for their own region, based on their own culture, their own religion, their own history, to build up an anti-imperialist state. So I see a lot of parallels.
Fantastic. If you would like to add something more, I'm all ears.
Okay, well, I just want to say that my organization, the Center for Political Innovation, we have been involved in trying to build up solidarity with Venezuela as well as solidarity with Iran. There was a national mobilization by the Democratic Party that happened this weekend called No Kings. Those rallies, in a lot of ways, we didn't agree with those rallies because they were supporting John Bolton, they were supporting NATO. We sent our members to those rallies to disrupt and say, hands off Venezuela. And if you want to oppose Trump, oppose his threats against Venezuela. And what was surprising is a number of the people attending the rallies were supportive and agreed with the message, hands off Venezuela, which was great. And it was a great way to intervene. And it kind of showed a gap. The major critique of Trump in the United States is that they argue he's authoritarian. Well, I would argue Trump is not authoritarian because he's not standing up to the rich and powerful. He's only going after countries like Venezuela. He's going after undocumented workers, but he's not taking action against the rich and powerful. And when he has started to do that, that's what the outrage is about. The fact that he may go after and he may imprison James Comey, the former FBI director. The fact that he may imprison John Bolton. And that's a good thing. And that we would like Trump to be more authoritarian and actually stand up to the rich and powerful, not obey the Miami Mafia, not obey the Israel lobby, and assert the will of the American people. We're not opposed to having a strong government. We just don't think Trump is a strong government. The No Kings critique and the overall stop Trump critique is they want Trump to be worse. They want Trump to be just kind of obeying the political establishment, and they fear any illiberalism or Bonapartism. Whereas our critique of Trump is that we view him as weak and as kind of obeying the American establishment. And it's important to make that distinction, and that many people in the United States are confused. And they think, well, if I support Venezuela, I support Iran, I can fit that into the No Kings agenda. And I can fit that into what Kamala Harris is saying and all of that. And this is an unfortunate delusion that the attacks on Trump are coming from a very bad place. The attacks on Trump are coming from forces that would like Trump to be a lot worse and like him to just be in line with the American political elite.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your profound insights and for sharing your valuable time with us today. I hope this conversation has opened a new window for understanding the seemingly intricate events shaping our world today. Thank you so much again. Bye-bye.